Recording already. Perfect.
Yep. All right. Guys, welcome to the How They Did It podcast. Max, Coleman, thank you so much for coming. Man, I drove this guy crazy. I was in the car, messed up the whole thing, but we're here. We're doing it. Max, thank you for coming. If you guys haven't seen Max Instagram, he's a researcher. Has amazing content where he actually shares some delicious recipes as he's teaching you how to get jacked. So it's 2 for 1. Definitely check out his page, Max. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate you saying that.
No, it's been fantastic. So, Max, I'm going to get into stuff with you right off the bat. And what I'm going to do is a selfish question because that's what we do here on the podcast. We're going to ask a selfish question right away. And it's something I've actually asked a couple people this week that I've been doing the podcast. I'm curious to hear your answer on this. I'm trying to bulk up, right? My goal is generally to get to 200 pounds over the next year or 2 years. I'm about like 178, 179 pounds. I don't know what's the best way to start with this. I'm currently probably really rough estimations, 22% body fat, that range, I'm guessing, right? Maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more. It's hard to tell, right? No. Do you believe that the best way to go about this is to get leaner and get a better P ratio or partitioning ratio? Or is it, since the general goal is to be around this body fat range, but 200 pounds, or would you just go with staying at like a slight surplus and kind of maybe what they call main gaining over the next 6 to 12 months? What's your way of thinking about this?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. There's a lot of conversations right now happening surrounding bulking. A lot of people are saying that bulking is vaulted, which I think is such a funny way of phrasing it. It ultimately depends on you, for your selfish question. It ultimately depends on what level of adiposity you're comfortable sitting around at. So I wouldn't suggest getting well above 20 to 25%, especially as a male. If you're trying to maximize muscle growth, or really if you're trying to maximize aesthetics, right? Because if the goal is just to get to 200 pounds, we can do that no problem, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like that's not an issue that we could have. But if you want to get to 200 pounds around a similar body fat percentage that you are currently, I would say that your best bet is probably just going with the really, really low and slow approach. So maybe like a 2 to 3 to 400 calorie surplus on top of whatever is maintenance for you, and just riding that out as long as you can until you start seeing that there is going to be like an unfavorable amount of fat gain in comparison to how much muscle you're growing, right? What I would not suggest, if the goal is ultimately to be at 200 pounds around 20% body fat ish, would be like trying to get lean first and then bulking your way there. You can do that. It's totally fine, but it's probably not going to help you get there any quicker. So the P ratio, the nutrition partitioning ratio, it's had a really logical, sound basis to why it would be the case. But just because something sounds logical doesn't always mean it's rational, right? So it actually seems to be the case that at a super low body fat percentage, like sub, I don't know, 8 or 6 or so for males, you actually are going to see a less favorable P ratio. So your body is going to prioritize putting fat on as opposed to muscle when you're that lean, which makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Muscle is really costly to have around. Everyone that you see walking around the gym today is infinitely more jacked than their ancestors were, and it's much safer to like front load those calories towards fat because we, for the last couple thousands of years, didn't know when our next meal was coming, as opposed to now when we obviously have the luxuries of modern day that we have. Nutrition partitioning ratio, the P ratio, I wouldn't rely too heavily on that if you're trying to achieve 200 pounds at 20-ish% body fat. I would say ride it out as long as you can, and then maybe we'll do some mini cuts or some full cuts along the way if you get to a level of adiposity you're not comfortable with. But 200 pounds at moderate body fat percentage, that's no small goal for the majority of people. So it's going to take time no matter which route you choose to take.
So I'm curious about this because I had somebody on recently. I don't know what her real name is because she doesn't say it. I know her real name, but I don't know if she wants people to know it. But so her name is a scientific snitch.
Yeah, for
Instagram.
sure. For sure.
Yeah. She was on and she was basically giving
She's big on team bulking is vaulted. I know that she thinks bulking is vaulted for sure.
Yeah, what do you consider? What's your take on her opinion on this? I don't know if you know it completely. Like, do you understand what, like, have you heard what her
I
argument
think her
is?
general standpoint is that if you're at a moderate to healthy body fat percentage, there's no real reason to bulk as opposed to just main gaining. I think her stance is that anabolism or hypertrophy is a signaling dependent mechanism as opposed to an energy dependent mechanism. And there's certainly a logical basis to what she's saying. I think that it's a little too early given the current state of literature. I mean, we have like three or four bulking studies that I can cite off the top of my head, maybe three or four. Yeah, somewhere around there. And so it's a little soon to say that it's vaulted or that there's an optimal way of going about vaulting or bulking, sorry. But I would say that I would hedge my bets by saying that you're probably better off doing a slight surplus if you're trying to maximize muscle growth, right? So for instance, you look at the study by Helms that came out during in the last couple of years. I think it's the most recent one, which found that basically doing a high surplus versus a very low surplus, no difference, no real difference in muscle growth there, but a lot more fat accumulation. However, they did see slightly better bicep gains with the group doing a high surplus because the biceps were getting a pretty substantial amount of training volume. So I think they're not to mention that in studies looking at untrained individuals, you actually do see better muscle growth in the groups doing a larger surplus. And then, of course, there's the famous Garth et al. Study where they compared a low to high surplus. And although the results did not reach statistical significance in that study, the group using a higher surplus did see slightly more muscle growth or slightly more lean tissue accrual than the small surplus group. So I would say that it's a little early to say that bulking is vaulted, but there does seem to be an energy component to it, meaning like you probably are better off if you're truly trying to build as much muscle as possible, you probably are better off having a small surplus associated with that, in my opinion, given the current.
Okay, I have to piggyback off of that with two more questions. So let's say, is there a difference from an individual? Because I'm a coach, obviously, for a long time. And even though I don't have like a scientific background, I generally guide my approach as a trainer around scientific principles. And I've realized from an anecdotal perspective, some clients react very differently, especially when it comes to bulking. So some clients who have a propensity to put on weight quicker, generally maybe they started out heavier, like we lost a whole bunch of weight to begin with, or they were heavy to just begin as we started out. They generally need a much smaller surplus in trying to go more, even if our goals are aggressive and their goals are aggressive. If we try to go too heavy of a surplus, they accumulate so much fat in the short period of time that it's really hard to even see how much muscle we're gaining to fat because we have to keep cutting the calories back. It's a constant battle. Obviously, dependent of consistency and everything else. And for sure, there's a possibility that they're lying to me and they're eating more than they're saying. Taking at their word what they're saying, this is something I've realized. While other people who quote unquote were hard gainers to begin with, or they were skinny to start out with, giving them an aggressive surplus seems to be quite effective to getting that muscle mass. Have you seen that? And is there anything in the literature that talks about that specificity of each individual?
So I don't think there's anything looking at, to be abundantly clear, the whole ecto-endo mesomorph thing is bullshit, but I'm just going to use those terms just for the purposes of this conversation. There's certainly no data looking at like a surplus effects on someone who's traditionally an endomorph versus an ectomorph, right? We don't have anything like that. But I would say that obviously for individuals that really struggle to put on weight, not even necessarily muscle mass, but just weight in general, obviously we're going to have to push that a little bit harder. I think this is ultimately more pragmatic than it is like because of some theoretical mechanism of action here. Like so for me, I'm like someone who just likes to sit at higher body fat percentages. It's very easy for me to gain weight. My body pushes back when I try to lose weight, stuff like that. So for me, I have to be really conscientious about my surplus because I could easily gain a substantial amount of weight very, very quickly if I'm not paying close attention to that. So for clients like myself and for myself, I have to treat my bulks kind of like with the same degree of precision as a cut, or else it goes off the rails very, very quickly for me. However, if I have individual, we've certainly all worked with what you said, like the hard gainers, the ectomorphs out there who really struggle to put on weight. And for them, it's kind of a let loose of the reins, like go eat, make sure we're getting in plenty of protein, and don't be afraid to have like a milkshake with your meal at the end of the day, or something like just something that we can do to ultimately get more energy into the system. Because like I said, one of the first bulking studies was done on untrained subjects, and they saw significantly more muscle growth with the group that was consuming a lot more extra calories throughout the day. Although an ectomorph is obviously different than an untrained lifter, I tend to think of them somewhat similarly, because if someone is an ectomorph or just a really skinny individual, it's unlikely that they've been training for a long time in the first place. So I would say push those a little bit harder. Obviously, like, we're going to need to gain some weight. Like, you can't just main gain your way up to 200 pounds at like a relatively lean body fat percentage. You know what I mean? Like, we're going to have to gain some weight in order to do that. And that energy is going to have to come from somewhere, i.e., food, obviously. Don't know if that was an actual answer to your question or not. I'm sorry for the ramble.
No, I think it was a super answer to my question. I think and I think using the ectomorph, endomorph, even though I'm in the exact same camp as you, I find that that's all bullshit, but it does put a nice mental image into my head of what you're saying. And I'm going to use that in the future because it's a good way of explaining it. This actually brings me down to something else. When you're, how much do you take it for your clients, or even for yourself when you're in a bulk? How important is it for you to know your body fat measurements, like, precisely?
One of my favorite things to talk about.
There you go.
Yeah, I love this topic. Go ahead. Sorry.
So no. So is it like, how important is it? Because I work with very high end clients for the most part. Like, outside of my online business, I'm a traveling trainer where I travel with my clients will pay me to do year-long plus contracts, and I travel around the world with them wherever they go, and I'm with them 24/7. And like, they normally have some crazy goal or something, and I try my best to help them get there. Those clients the high-end clients will be very like, we need to know exactly our body fat percentage. We got to go get the DEXA scan. We got to go get everything to know exactly to move forward before we move forward. And I'll generally do that if they have the resources. Why not? Awesome. But a lot of the other people I work with, especially online, that's not anywhere close to the reality of what they're living like. They're just somebody that wants to gain some muscle, and they have their goals are just as serious and just as important to them. But it's not realistic. They're going to spend $99 on a DEXA scan, to go do that. They're already paying the membership. So where do you lie in all this, and what's your opinion on it?
Yeah, like I said, man, I love talking about this, because even though I'm like, a science guy with respect to training and nutrition and stuff like that, I think that these super precise, accurate measures tell us nothing at the end of the day. Because, like, ultimately, what is it that we're trying to do in the gym? Like, 99% of your clients are just trying to improve their body composition, or just trying to improve their body image. And that's a whole other topic in of itself. But my point is, like, what does knowing that number actually provide you with? I mean, like, I always use the example of, people are very quick to be like, I want to be 10% body fat. Like, I really want to be 10% body fat. And I always pose the question of, well, first of all, why? What's so special about the 10% body fat number that we're trying to achieve? But more seriously, like, what if at 10%, we get down to 12% body fat and you are fucking diced? Am I allowed to cuss on this podcast? Sorry.
Yeah, as much as you want.
All right, perfect. And you're just shredded to the bone, but your DEXA comes back at 12%. Who gives a fuck what your DEXA says? Like, if you achieved the goal, and now this number is in your head, and it's like, it ultimately is like, oh, wow, maybe I need to keep do you need to keep cutting? Why? Like, you've already achieved the actual goal, and this proxy of the goal, this like number that we're getting from some machine, doesn't comport with what you actually wanted to achieve. Who cares? And the contrast of that is, let's say that you're like a little soft around the edges. Maybe you're starting to see some outlines of your abs. You go get a DEXA and it's like 8%. What do we do now? Are you just satisfied because we got below 10, but you're still like not nearly as shredded as you may want to be for whatever reason you wanted to be shredded? Like, no. I think that we use these tools as proxy measures for the things we actually care about, when in reality, just looking at yourself in the mirror is far more valuable. And look, I hate to do this because like I don't want to get caught up in the whole like body positivity issue here. Like you should love yourself no matter what you look like, obviously, but we have aesthetic goals in this field. But like that is what we ultimately care about. And I think progress photos, as like simple and maybe rudimentary as they may seem, are ultimately far more important to you than any, even the most valuable. Like you could do like not even just a DEXA, but you could go do an MRI if you wanted to check your body
Yeah.
composition. You could spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars to do that. But ultimately, it's not telling you jack shit if it's not comporting with the actual aesthetics of your body composition. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of where I
Makes
stand on
perfect
it.
sense. I think it makes perfect sense. Like I do this with clients a lot of times that like we'll do progress photos and like they'll come to me like I want to lose 20 pounds. And like we lose 15 pounds. But they started lifting weights for the first time in their life, really. Like or at least seriously lifting weights with the program. And they look better than ever. And they're not 20 pounds down and the weight loss is slowing, but they look better, much, much better. And I'll kind of have this conversation with them like, what was your actual goal here? Was it to get the number? Because if that's it, I used to cut weight. I was a professional fighter. I'll get you in a bathtub. We'll drop, we'll drop 30 pounds and there you go. You won, you will drop the weight, I'll dehydrate you till you feel like death and you weigh yourself on scale and you won. Does it change anything? It changes nothing. The goal is now you're putting on muscle and we're losing weight a little bit slower because we're recomping. This is a super good problem to have. Like we are winning on every level.
Which, by the way, not to mention, this is just another piggyback off of that. Just some like this is get a bit more of the nerdy, less pragmatic side. But like, just for those that don't know, you can't measure your body fat percentage. It's literally
Yeah.
impossible to do. If you wanted to directly measure your body fat percentage, you would need to dissect yourself and actually chemically analyze the amount of adiposity you have in your body. It's a really disgusting process that will get this podcast demonetized if I actually go through
Yeah.
the step-by-step process of how we would directly measure body fat percentage. So not only is body fat percentage a proxy for what we actually care about, which is aesthetics, right? But it's not even a proxy for that. It's a proxy for what we actually care about, right? So I try to hit this home really hard that like I never pay too much attention to what body fat percentage you get from an in body or even for something like really really advanced like a DEXA or
Yeah. And I think that it's funny that I had this conversation recently with one of my clients who's also a friend of mine. And he said, I sent him a picture of like how I look right now. And he was like, man, like you're looking jacked. Like, what are you like 15% body fat? I was like, honestly, if my bet is like anything 18 to 22, but I really don't care. Like, I see that I top two abs, and normally that's a little less body fat, but I have big abs because I did jujitsu for like, 20 plus years. I just, my core is big. So I think I'm a bit higher than what you think, but yeah, it's cool. Like this is kind of what I wanted. Like this was the goal was to be jacked and big and like and it's all for shits and giggles anyway. I'm not a bodybuilder. Like it's all for fun and enjoy myself. And yeah, I remember him going like, oh, but like you want to do a DEXA? I'm like, to be honest, I don't care enough. Like it's not worth it. Like I'm gonna get one. I think there's also a psychological factor that if it doesn't come out what you think it is, or worse, even the strongest minded of us are easy to go like, man, am I messing up? Well, the truth is I haven't been that great. And I know it from being positive and excited to go to the gym. Now you're feeling defeated and you're not as motivated to go. And you're like, man, I'm not doing as good as I thought I was. And it affects people psychologically, even outside, like we understand that this is going to affect us psychologically. So I'm like, why enter that world to begin with?
Yeah, I like couldn't. In fact, actually, the first people I ever heard talk about this was on the 3DMJ podcast. I don't remember which individual it was, but they were basically saying like, I don't even like using these measures because they can end up doing more harm than good sometimes. So, for instance, I would have a client that's like really trucking along on their weight loss. Things are looking really, really good. They're super happy with their progress. And then they go get a DEXA that says that they're 13% body fat when they thought that they were 7% body fat. And they just took this really like gratifying and rewarding feeling that they were getting from all the hard work they'd done and then squashed it because of an arbitrary measure that doesn't really tell us much at all. So I definitely try to avoid using it pretty much all the time. Now, obviously, there are instances where measuring your body fat percentage might be useful, but generally speaking, and especially for Gen Pop, like it's never something that I'm going to spend any time and certainly not any money to.
Well, that's great. And listen, to kind of like move on to to something else that people might be interested in. I know that you did a lot of your studying with Dr. Schoenfeld. You did a lot of work on like drop sets, and this is something that I'm curious about because for years I was a big proponent of drop sets and different intensity sets, and my logic was always twofold. One, as far as a time saver, which I think is super important because people are in the gym. I have 45 minutes to be in the gym, let's say, or an hour, and I got a lot of things going on. And for the normal person, like this is like already an extra that I'm pulling myself away from. If I can get this done quicker, great. I think that's one. Two, I've always been a big proponent of it because most people are very bad at estimating RIR. So they're like, oh, like most clients, especially online, I'm like, how was that? Like, great, yeah. I'm like, how come you did 185 for 10, 10, 10, 10? Are you sure that was as difficult as we had programmed? Like, yeah, it was super hard. I'm like, it's unlikely if that was like a 0 to 2 RR, you did 10 and then you did 10 again and 10 again. Like, that seems unlikely to me in my experience. And I would add things like intensity sets and I would just see the results be a little bit better. But I know from most of the literature that they might be slightly underperforming straight sets. Am I wrong with saying this?
Yeah, I don't maybe there's some data out there to suggest that. I'm not aware of it. Basically all of the data we have on drop sets would suggest that there's essentially no difference between drop sets and straight sets. And they do save you usually more than double they take less than half the time of straight sets. So I'm also a big fan, especially for the time saving homies out there. But I don't think there's any sacrifice being done. There are some logical reasons to think that maybe on a per set basis they're not as effective as traditional sets, but given just how much time you can save with them, that probably balances out, meaning like you might have to do an extra drop, you might have to do like a set followed by like 3 drops to get the same growth that you would from just doing 3 sets in general. But again, given how much time they save, that's kind of a non-issue, if that makes sense. Now, I will say drop sets do fucking suck. Like they're miserable, and people tend to rate them. This is like clear in the data as well, that people tend to rate them at higher RPE. So people tend to perceive them as more challenging. So it's kind of like, would you rather go to prison for like a minimum security prison would you rather go to like a maximum security prison for 3 years or a minimum security prison for 5 years? It's like, would you rather spend more time being less miserable or less time being more miserable? It's kind of like a trade-off there, ultimately, what you're.
Yeah, I always found that from a personal basis too. I don't use them as much as I used to, simply from a fact of I find it a little bit harder because I'm constantly changing gyms because I travel so much, like literally on a weekly basis, I'm at a different gym. If I kind of use a drop set on one piece of equipment, the weights are slightly different, or I can kind of control things a little bit more and see am I actually progressing. But as far as an enjoyment factor, I actually found, because I come from a fighting background, it kind of had that like intensity aspect, that weightlifting in the beginning of my weightlifting journey, I didn't enjoy as much. I didn't have that like, oh, I'm going to battle through this, while the drop set factor would have this psychological benefit of like, I finished a set of like leg extensions that normally would be like, cool. And now I'm like, oh my God, my legs are shaking. I feel that like I did something that's psychological. I went home proud of myself for this hard workout factor from it. That's just a personal bias. But I actually have a question for you. If you were to like program drop sets, let's use something like leg extension. Would you do it like 2 straight sets and then 1 set with 3 drop sets at the end? Or would you do 2 sets that have 3 drop sets at the end? How would you program it to fit in? Would you say each drop set is equivalent to one actual set? How would you do that?
Yeah, so different people have different quantifying methods for drop sets. So, like some people, like Milo Wolf, for instance, he was the first person I ever heard say this. He was basically like, whatever number of sets you were going to do, just add an extra drop to it. This was the example I just gave. And this is typically how I go about it. So, like, if you were going to do 4 sets, do 1 set followed by 4 drops. And that would be like a relatively close example. That being said, the drop set literature we have, I think we have 5 studies on this. There may have been another one. So I think there was another one that was published since my meta analysis or our meta analysis. But essentially, the way that they quantify them is different study to study. So there's some studies where you would do the same number of drops that there were sets and they saw the same growth. But we also saw some studies where they did more sets and more drops compared to the traditional sets and they also saw similar growth. So it's a little hard to say right now. Now, as far as how I would go about doing it for my clients, it would come down to why they're trying to do it. So are you using drop sets because you have 20 minutes to get in the gym twice a week? I'm probably not going to have you do any straight sets in that regard. I'm probably going to have you do drop sets and supersets for the majority of your muscles, just so that we can really pack in volume in such a short period of time. But if you're looking to maximize muscle growth, you're like, I don't really give a shit about time. Yeah, I think I would do something like a finisher, kind of like what you were saying earlier. Like I would have you do your normal sets. And then just to pack in a little bit more volume at the end of your workout, I would have you like the last set of whatever exercise you were going to do. We'll turn that into a drop set and we'll do like maybe 2 or 3 drops on that. Like just, it's just one way or another way for us to like really like tackle in the volume without you having to spend like 2+ hours in the gym every single.
And that makes perfect sense. That makes perfect sense. I think that it's interesting. Recently, sometimes I'm guilty of this as well. Is that there's a level of training too that I think for most people, the general population, somebody tell my clients, and sometimes I'll nerd out with them, and I'm like, oh, we got to design the program like this. We got to try this. We'll maximize the volume. And I don't know if you ever seen this like this meme where it's like the cave, like the dummy, the guy in the middle, and
Oh,
the
I
super
love it,
smart
dude.
guy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite memes. And I feel like sometimes like the bro lifters in some sense and like the super science based guys, the conclusion is quite similar. And it's just kind of train pretty hard. How hard exactly? Hard is a good answer to that, like,
It honestly is. Yeah, yeah. Like I
yeah,
talk about this a lot. Like just train, bro, is better advice than people often give it credit for. Like
yeah,
it really is. I think my
yeah,
favorite example of the bell curve. I've never actually seen anyone do this before, but and maybe I'll make it for a video or something. But like the bell curve, right, and the bottom the low IQ people over here are saying that 8 to 12 is the bodybuilding range, and then the middle being like, no, you can grow muscle anywhere from 5 to 50 reps. The data is incredibly clear. This blah 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 blah. As long as you're going to failure, data equated, and then the actual smart people again, or the high IQ people being like, no, 8 to 12 is a good bodybuilding rep range. Actually, yeah, yeah,
that worked for a lot of years or
for
works.
sure. It's also so just to continue, like I actually do believe that. Like I think that the majority of your training probably should be in that like I say 8 to 12 just because it's what's commonly used, but like 5 to 12 is probably like a good place to stick in. And my only reason for saying that is because one, if a set of 20 and a set of 5 cause the same amount of muscle growth, but one takes 4 times longer theoretically, I'm going to choose to stick closer to 5s for time saving. But even more so than that, people tend to find it easier to approach failure with heavy weights than they do with lighter weights.
Yes.
Like for anyone listening, if you've actually, and be honest with yourself, if you've actually ever done a set of 25 on any exercise to failure, I mean, that is infinitely more miserable and grueling than doing a set of 8 to failure. So it's a lot easier for people to like approach failure with lower weights or heavier weights too.
I actually almost rarely ever, unless my client has no equipment and they only can work out of their house, do sets above 20. And my reasoning behind it is, again, anecdotally, I've realized that clients will start like getting pains in like their tendons and like their parts of their body that aren't the muscle that's desired to get it. Like their technique might start getting a bit sloppy as they're getting tired. And I just realized that a lot of the time it's like, yeah, sure, this can grow as much muscle theoretically, but if for whatever reason your tendons are a bit achy and like your cardiovascular is just not great and now you're like you're trying to hit these push-ups and it's like, oh my God, I'm gonna pass out and I can't do it. And it's like it's really hard to know if you're why you're hitting failure for, especially for like untrained lifters or for the general population. Like I'm quite sure if someone like you goes in the gym, you're much more understanding of like, okay, this is me being a bit tired. I can keep pushing. Well, someone else will be like, I don't know, this kind of sucks. My elbow kind of feels weird. Fuck this, done. I'm done with that.
For sure.
And I think that there's another thing that is important as far as training goes. And I've realized even with myself, and sometimes I feel like I was in that exact like that meme that we're talking about. And I'm the middle guy. Like I try to outsmart myself sometimes. And I learned this that I was like trying to do like the optimal program for myself. And I was doing it to my clients too. And I get a lot of my clients were complaining to me. Like, oh, it's boring, or this and that. And I was trying to make it super optimal. And then I pulled back and I was like, you know what? Sometimes we're training for what the reason for training is to get better, have fun. It should be part of it, I think, is, as Mike Israel says, I love this, is like, it's for your spirit animal shit. Like I want to overhead press because like that's my spirit animal shit. Sure, that's not the best exercise for shoulders. Sure, you're getting it a lot with your other press movements, but it's like, yeah, I want to fucking lift things over the top of my head because it's cool.
It's
Like,
alpha shit, dude. And there's
it's
nothing wrong with
alpha
that.
shit.
I mean, there's nothing
And
wrong
there's
with that.
nothing wrong with that. Yeah. And if that keeps you I think if that keeps you in the gym, if you're like looking forward to like smashing your overhead press PR, even if it's at 3 reps, and maybe that's not optimal for hypertrophy, you still are getting hypertrophy from that. Am I incorrect by saying that? Like you
No.
are still,
Yeah, in
still
fact,
growing.
there is certainly data exists showing. I don't know the PMID like some of my other researcher counterpart geniuses, but there are
Yeah.
studies showing that you can get muscle growth with actually reps way outside of the ranges we normally recommend. Way outside, like there are studies showing growth at 10 with 3 reps in a set, right? And we also have actually one of the drop set studies found muscle growth with like hundreds of reps, like not hundreds, but over 100 reps per set, which
Yeah.
is fucking ludicrous level of torture. I want to bookend this quickly with respect to the rep ranges because I do want it stated that if you are trying to maximize muscle growth, like you're truly trying to eke out every eraser full of muscle growth you possibly can, each gram year over year, you probably should train through a wide spectrum of rep ranges because there might be some unique either fiber specific growth or some specific anabolic mechanism that is triggered using higher rep sets as opposed to lower rep sets. So I would never say like never do your 20 to 30 rep sets if you're someone trying to like eke out as much muscle as you can. But for the majority of people out there, I would say, yeah, don't worry about training well over 20 reps. It's probably not going to do you any real benefit. Usually I quantify it in like if my grandma can't tell the difference between training interventions, like meaning like if my grandma can't tell the difference between if I only ever trained with 8 to 12 versus I did a wide spectrum of rep ranges, it's probably not worth worrying about for the average person.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm 100% in agreement. And I want to actually throw something that's kind of a question I've had. I've heard the answer to this. I like hearing different perspectives of it. So CrossFit athletes are hybrid training athletes that do these training modalities that are like weightlifting mixed with cardio mixed with some kind of explosive movements, right? You see some significant muscle growth in people doing these exercises, right? A lot of the athletes, especially at the higher levels, are pretty jacked. And if you go to a CrossFit gym, like you'll see a lot of dudes and gals that are beastly. How do you see the principles of the way they train? Are they gaining muscle just because they're hitting adequate volumes? Is it because of their nutrition items? How are they avoiding the interference? In fact, I'm kind of curious on your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, there's actually a seemingly popular question. While you were asking it, I went and checked just because I wanted to make sure. But like Steve Hall of the Revive Stronger podcast, like his most popular interview he's ever done was with Mike Israel, and the question was, "Why are CrossFitters so jacked?" Which is it's a reasonable question, and because they aren't doing bodybuilding training, right? They do a lot of running, they do a lot of swimming, they do a lot of cardiovascular work to the point where it's important to say that like the interference effect isn't something to worry about for the majority of people, but CrossFitters are doing so much anaerobic or aerobic exercise that it should theoretically interfere with their muscle growth capacity. That being said, CrossFitters are training with really high volumes. They're training really close to failure in a lot of instances. And they're using a lot of exercises that are beneficial for muscle growth, right? They're using like your standard barbell movements for a lot of what they're doing. So it's no surprise that they're jacked, but I think it's important to note that one, when we're thinking of CrossFitters, we're generally thinking of like the Rich Fronings, the Matt Frasers, like the top dogs, right? And those guys were going to be jacked no matter what they did. You know what I mean? Like they're genetically gifted individuals, so they could look at weights and they'll get an anabolic response, which isn't to say that like which is to say that they could probably be more jacked if they weren't doing CrossFit. Like if Matt Fraser switched over to bodybuilding specific training, he'd probably be more jacked than he would be if he was doing CrossFit. But obviously, more jacked doesn't mean you're not jacked when you're doing the other thing, right? So of course, CrossFitters are going to be jacked because they're following like the basic principles of bodybuilding training or the basic boulders of bodybuilding training, which are essentially train a lot, right? So use adequate volumes, train hard, so train close to failure, and then use exercises that are, going to actually target the muscles that we're interested in growing, right? So it's no secret.
Yeah, I agree. I wanted to ask it because one of the reasons that I think it's popular is I get asked it a lot from clients because a lot of clients that come when they think they want to get jacked, what they're actually thinking isn't Rodney Coleman. I'm just
Yeah,
going
yeah,
obviously addiction,
for
but
sure. Yeah.
they're thinking Rich Froning. That's what they're thinking is jack.
They're honestly thinking of Brad Pitt from Fight Club.
They're thinking of Brad.
Like it was just like a string bean by today's standards, but like that is what the average person like genuinely wants to look like, generally speaking.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying the case. And a lot of times, though, I think what my argument is because I've programmed a lot of coaches. Like I worked with strength conditioning coaches for a long time. That was my original background from fighting. A lot of the programming I used to do, for the most part, was more similar. Like I guess you would call it like metabolic conditioning. They call it like these people like it was like around the style CrossFit-y style program for the everyday people. And what I realized is that's great and that works, but not as well for the time period allotted than if we just did this like traditional bodybuilding approach. So if your goal is to be jacked and ripped and look like Brad Pitt or even close to Rich Froning, you could do it by trying to be this CrossFit style athlete. That's going to probably much harder, much more difficult for you to control that outcome than if we just use this kind of traditional quote unquote boring approach of like bodybuilding, diet, exercise in this way. So that's why I've shifted for the most general population people to do that because they think that this super hard thing is going to get them there. But I think that's actually a much longer route to get there. And yes, they can, but just a longer, harder route. Do you agree with me on that?
Yeah, I mean, of course, man. Like the whole reason I was CrossFit pilled for a while, and the whole reason I was even doing CrossFit is because I wanted to be jacked like CrossFitters. And again, you can get jacked through like a limitless number of means. But if someone comes to me with aesthetic aspirations, I'm going to put them on a bodybuilding style program because it's going to be the most direct route to achieving the goal that they're trying to achieve with respect to their physique, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't achieve it through other means, but it simply is the most direct and efficient way of improving someone's body composition is through bodybuilding training and some concomitant dietary intervention as well.
One, we're on agreement here, and I want to ask one last thing before I let you go. I wanted to ask you about your cooking and your Instagram and your content creation and the business side of what you're doing. You're coaching clients, right? People that would like to talk with you, they can reach out to you on Instagram. I just want to let everyone know that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what brought you on the Instagram? What brought you that idea? It was really creative. I'm a big fan of it. Doing the cooking, adding it together. What was your inspirations as far as from the business side of things?
Well, so thank you. First of all, that's very nice of you to say. And I'm still fairly new to this. So I've only been doing this for a year now. But ultimately, the reason that I did it was because individuals were telling me to do so. So like Brad Schoenfeld, like Dr. Schoenfeld, Milo Wolf, and Dr. Pack were all like, bro, like start posting. Like, what are you doing? Like, get out there and start like actually putting yourself out there. And obviously it's like a scary thing to do. Like, there's no like false humility here. It was like I was terrified to post my first reel where I was doing this, but I knew that I wasn't going to be able to establish credibility with my physique, just not the most genetically gifted out there. Like, fuck you, mom and dad. I love you all to death, but you just didn't give me the best muscle growth capacity here. So I knew I wasn't going to be able to just be another talking head who could rely on being jacked to establish credibility. And I also don't have my PhD, so I couldn't just rely on having like a doctor in my name either. So I needed to come up with some way to post and kind of like grab people's attention without relying on those two commonly relied upon sources of credibility. And when I first started about a year ago is when we kind of started seeing like a huge rise in those videos where the top half of the screen would just be like Joe Rogan interviewing someone, and then the bottom half of the screen would be like someone cutting a bar of soap or cleaning a rug or playing like Subway Surfer. And I was like, I could probably do this, but with cooking, because it's just something I know and love. And the top half of the screen could be me like talking about different topics that are really interesting to me, like fitness and nutrition and stuff like that. So that was ultimately the impetus, was just do something that gets people's eyes on the screen, and then what keeps them there is like the valuable information that I'm providing. So that was kind of my working hypothesis for what would work, and it did okay.
I actually loved it, and one of the reason I loved it so much was that it's something that I kind of struggled with too. I don't know if you've ever seen my page,
Yeah, of
but
course.
at some point, like I got really, really ripped on a bet with my client. One of my clients was like, I bet you can't get down to single digit body fat in like 12 weeks or something. And I was pretty big, to be honest. I was like, damn, I was like, you know what? Let's go. And I did it, went on this ridiculous kind of like a protein sparing modified fast for like 7 weeks, lost like a ton of weight. It was looking kind of jacked. And it was like, I realized it was the first, I was posting pictures of me shirtless a lot on Instagram, just cause I was like, oh, cool. I want to save these cause I'm not keeping this. This is not fun at all. I just want to get done with this. And then I started getting into posting and opening my online business. And a part of me was like, well, I don't want to stay at this super lean, say I was 8 to 12% body fat. I don't want to stay in this range all the time. I just don't feel comfortable. I'm not happy. I like to go out and have wine with my wife. I like to have desserts. I was obese as a child. So all the way to older adolescent. So hunger signalings are crazy. It takes a lot of white knuckling and willpower. And I was like, well, I'm competing with a bunch of dudes that are super jacked, super ripped, posting every day. I have some credibility due to the people I've trained, but still people immediately is like, what's going to keep me onto the screen is going to be the guy ripped. And I'm like, well, I don't want to just be that guy. And that's kind of held me back from doing it for a long time. And then I started posting those pictures where I was ripped and then I started trying to add more entertainment value. I saw what you were doing and I was like, this is great. And not that you don't have a great physique or you're not, but it is in the world of Instagram, things are so convoluted to what great physique is that I definitely think that this is, how do they call it? I definitely think that this is important for other people that are creators, trainers that want to get on social media, that with a little bit of creativity, there's ways to get people on the screen to see if you watch a video and then you don't notice how much knowledge that you have and how you can help somebody like yourself, then that person probably isn't the best client for you anyway. And better they do find somebody that has a six-pack app that they're going to listen to. But like, if I watch you, I'd be like, oh, this guy's awesome. I would love to have him as my coach. I wouldn't need to see that if you had a six-pack or not, because I understand, the basics.
I think that's because you're like a logical thinker, right? I've actually talked about this before, but we tend to treat fitness influence or just fitness like coaches and like personal trainers differently from not only just other fields in general, but even within like physical activity, we treat them differently from other coaches. So like, for instance, you would like never like, not you, but proverbially you, like people tend to not hire like the out of shape personal trainer, for instance, but like a personal trainer's like six pack or lack of six pack tells you virtually nothing about their like knowledge about how to get a six pack, right? So like we would never, and we don't ask Coach K who I think is a famous basketball coach. I don't know jack shit about
Yeah.
sports, but we wouldn't expect a basketball coach to like be able to dunk. But for some reason, you can't be a personal trainer unless you're jacked or shredded or some combination of the two, right?
I think that's it's funny because for me, that's why it never was like that because I come from a fighting background and I mean this in the nicest way. I could probably beat up a lot of my coaches, like if we got in a fight with them, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the fact that this guy has 40 years, 50 years of experience in this game, however old he is. He understands the nuance. He's seen other fighters make the mistakes. He understands the technique. He sat and broken it down from a different perspective. And so much of fighting is based off of your natural athleticism. So much of the way you look is based off of your genetics. Also, if you're taking anabolic steroids, so on and so forth, all can change the dynamics. And I think that that's why it's so confusing to people. People are like, oh, I think it's just people really downplay the effects of genetics in the place of lifestyle choice. Like for me, I can get a six pack. I've done it before, right? I've been single digit body fat. It's not enjoyable for me. That no hate at all to anybody that does do it. I think it's
Yeah, of
awesome.
course.
Even inspired by them. Like, man, I got to get better. I can't let myself get, but at the same token, you just have to accept that each trainer might just not have it. That doesn't make him any worse of a trainer. And yeah, in this day of social media, things are extra. It's a little extra.
For sure. And yeah, I wasn't trying to like dog on my own physique by any means. Like, just to be clear, I was just saying that like by like fitness influencer standards, I'm like simultaneously obese and emaciated just because of how skewed like the like what we consider like a normal physiques to be. Like you have to have like 3D delts and a six pack year round to be considered like you to look like you even have ever stepped foot in a gym once. Like it's crazy.
It's bananas. It's funny. I see people comment on like Mike Israel's point, like, bro, you suck. You weren't even an IBBF pro. It's like, do you know what it takes to be an IBBF pro? Like, do you understand how much what factors at play? Like, are you guys crazy? Like, I'm not saying you have to agree with everything. I'm super down for everyone disagreeing with everybody. I love the discourse. I like love bringing people on that have different opinion. But come on, is that your standard of proof? That's pretty low. Like,
Yeah.
you're not really thinking about this too much.
Dude, I don't know what it is about fitness. Like I talk about this all the time. Like I love fitness, I love science, and I don't know what it is about lifting weights that attracts such a mouth-breathing crowd sometimes. Like I swear, bro. I don't know what it is about lifting weights that is so attractive to such low IQ, smooth-brained individuals, but for some reason it just harbors that environment. Obviously, I'm poking fun. I'm being a little bit facetious, but like it is crazy the lack of like thought that a lot of people give to their opinions in this field. Like not taking Mike Israel's opinion on something because he's not an IFBB pro. Like, are you fucking stupid? Like, do you really think that big, like, we don't, again, not to use the same analogy, we don't expect what basketball team does LeBron play for now? See,
Yeah, LA Lakers.
okay, I don't know who the coach for the LA Lakers is, but we don't expect him to beat LeBron one-on-one in a like basketball game, right? That doesn't mean that he's a bad coach. And it's the same thing. It's like
Even have
why?
play. I'll take it a step further. You don't even have expect him to have played in the NBA at any point in time.
Yeah. Of course not. Yeah, it's a great example. Like why do you have to achieve this thing that like 0.0001% of people could achieve? Even if you like injected them with the work ethic of every IFBB pro, their genetics still might not allow them to achieve the same goals of IFBB pros, right? But people for some reason just don't believe that. The term outwork your genetics has got to be like the most like the dumbest thing I think I've ever heard in my entire life.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's that. I think that it's two things. I think one, people have this theory that like you can be, and I don't want to downplay. Like you can get amazing results. Like I'm a person that has overachieved my genetic potential. I was obese. I was never athletic, and I made it to the UFC. And I probably could have done a little bit better had I not struggled with yo-yo dieting, had I not been more consistent. I could have probably done a notch better than what I did even. But so I'm 100% for pushing to the absolute maximum that you could do. But so much of being a coach has to do with understanding human psychology, understanding the actual science behind whatever the art is or whatever you're coaching, that sometimes the better coaches are the guys that aren't that. I think one of the reasons that I'm a pretty good trainer, I don't want to toot my horn, but I think one of the reasons I've had a lot of success with clients is because I'm obese. I've dealt with eating disorders from the standpoint of binge eating. I'm that guy. I'm you in this situation. I
Just
know
10 years ahead.
just 10 years ahead. Like, I know that feeling when you took one bite of the cookie and now the whole cookie jar has to be gone. I'm that guy. So yeah, I could be there. But because I'm that guy, I'm probably not the guy that's going to, you know, walk around with the six pack all day, because that would probably lead to me going back into my more eating disordered attitudes. I think that's a thing that separates. I mean, this is a whole different rant, but yeah, I found that interesting. I like the way that you brought it in. And that's why you did it.
No, I think that's a really beautiful example, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. Earlier, I said "fuck you, mom and dad" for giving me
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
genetics that they did. Obviously, tongue in cheek, I'm joking, but on the other, on like the glass half full approach, is like, thank you, mom and dad, for giving me my less than favorable muscle growth potential, because that is ultimately what led me down to learning every single thing that I possibly could about how to maximize muscle growth. Right? If I had shown up to the gym, I've been lifting since I was 12. So if I had showed up to the gym in sixth grade and just blew up, got great results immediately, I would have never even thought twice to look into how to go about maximizing muscle growth, because, like, why the fuck would I? Like, I don't need to do that. So
Yeah.
I agree. I think you're almost better off like hiring people that didn't get favorable results early on. And I think like Steve Hall is like a great example of this. Like Steve Hall, physique is fucking insane. Like he looks insane. He's got like the biggest arms in the game. But he didn't start out that way. And he also didn't start out by getting great results, which led him down the rabbit hole. Now he fortunately was able to like build an insane physique, but he did so because he learned every possible thing he could about how to do so. So I think that that's like a really, really great point. So thank you for saying that more concisely than I did.
No. So, by the way, shout out to Steve Hall. He's the man. Max, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I took up a whole bunch of time. Normally I keep these at 30 minutes, but I was having fun and I was like, let's just keep this rolling. So I appreciate it. Thanks for coming on. I would love to have you back on and maybe have you back on with a couple other people and we can mix up the conversation and get it nice and fun. I hope you enjoyed yourself.
Yeah, man, this was a ton of fun, and I'll any chance that I can take to talk about lifting, I'm happy to do so. And if that's with other people or just myself, that's totally fine. So I'd happy to come back on.
All right. I appreciate it, Max. Guys, that's a pod.